Welcome to Bullshift the podcast. My name is John DeGuy. I'm the host of the podcast and the author of the book Bullshift. This is a podcast that talks about behavioral finance in general, with a specific focus on how the financial services industry shifts your attention to make you feel more bullish. My guest this week is Peter Victor. Peter is Professor Emeritus at York University and a renowned expert on sustainable economics. He's written two groundbreaking books, Managing Without Growth, which was used as a reference in writing Bullshift, and his latest book, Escape From Overshoot, which is what we have right here. Hopefully you can see that. Peter, welcome.
Well, thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
I wonder if we can begin by having you explain the challenge of overshoot, what it is and why it's a concern.
I'm glad to do that. Overshoot refers to the predicament we find ourselves in, and I'm talking now about humanity in general, that there are so many of us consuming so much, of course, not all the same, but there's a lot of inequality. But speaking broadly, the result is that humans are having an impact on the planet, on the biosphere, that is not sustainable. And one way of talking about that is to look at the extent to which the resources of the planet are being regenerated and the rate at which we are using them. And unfortunately, the rate at which we're using them now far exceeds the rate at which they're being regenerated. And that's what we mean by overshoot.
Right. That brings me to something that a lot of the people listening might be familiar with. In 1972, Dennis Meadows over at MIT and his colleagues published a very important book paper called Limits to Growth. And in it, they foresaw the collapse of the global economy in the first half of the 21st century, or the 21st century, yeah. And as fate would have it, we're now a little over 50 years after the original report was released. And sadly, it seems as though what we've been experiencing is following along their base case scenario, which is to say it's been remarkably accurate in mapping out what they saw as being the future, which is now the present, for our planet and for our society. Do you believe politicians and voters recognize the path that we're on?
Sadly, generally speaking, I would say no. What they do perceive as some of the symptoms of overshoot, some of the symptoms of that collapse scenario that you've just described. For example, climate change. It's in the news. It comes and goes from the news, at least from the headlines. But I think there is clearly an increasing awareness of the seriousness of this problem, and that can easily be understood as the discharge of greenhouse gases by humans, mostly from combustion of fossil fuels, that exceeds the capacity of the atmosphere to accommodate those greenhouse gases. So we're getting an accumulation in the atmosphere, and that has the effect of raising the average temperature of the planet. And so we're now seeing an increased frequency of wildfires, storms, weather that people didn't anticipate. By the way, climate change is a very good term for it because climate can change in numbers of different directions. And so we can see more snowfall in areas which typically don't get any snowfall, and so on. So yes, there's that. To that extent, there is a growing awareness of these problems, but they tend to be seen as sort of isolated problems. Well, if we just fix climate change, we can then carry on as normal and enjoy the benefits of economic growth and so on. However, overshoot is a broader concept than just climate change. We can list 9 or 10 separate issues. They relate to one another in some sense, but they are separate. For example, the shortage of fresh water in many parts of the world is a very, very serious problem. The loss of biocapacity, the destruction of habitat for wildlife. So we're looking at a much bigger, more complicated problem than just climate change. And I don't think that aspect is adequately perceived at all by politicians or business leaders, any leaders. I would even say in the academic world, it's not appreciated well enough.
I would also go so far as to point out that it's not particularly well appreciated by investors because it has ramifications for your portfolio. And a lot of people they're blithely going about their business, enjoying their lives and a high quality of life on the naive supposition that things will only get better, and what we've grown accustomed to in the past is a reasonable expectation of what we should be expecting going forward. One of the things that I loved about, again, I'm going to hold up a copy of the book Escape from Overshoot and going through it, was that you and I both uh, take exception with traditional economics. So in Bullshift, I talk about how traditional neoclassical economics is a paradigm for how people look at supply and demand and what might happen for stock prices. And a lot of people are in the finance world and in the world of giving advice are oblivious to behavioral economics. You, on the other hand, spend a couple of chapters going through what happened with Keynes and with Marx, and then you start moving on to the more contemporary with Milton Friedman and whatnot. What we learned from economists, how they move the ball forward, but also how their models are limited in that they don't necessarily take into account externalities and the way things work. You actually pointed out that John Stuart Mill was one of the people who envisioned hopefully the notion of a steady state where things can be sustainable. And I'm wondering if you could weigh in on the extent to which it is even possible for even contemporary economists to get their head around the notion of overshoot and how they need to adopt their models because they've been very slow to adopt them up until now.
Well, I think you've highlighted a very serious problem. And I think it stems very much from the way economics is taught. Um, and I've been involved in teaching it and practicing it for half a century. So I've got some now long experience in this. Too often, the economy is presented as sort of a freestanding entity where you have buyers and sellers and markets and prices being determined, just as you said, without any real notion that this is taking place within a planetary system, a
Mm-hmm.
planet, of course, and without the continual inflow of materials and energy from the biosphere. I use the word biosphere, planet, Earth, uh, synonymously, and I'll do that for this conversation. Without an appreciation that there's this continual requirement for materials and energy and a place for where economic activity can take place, and resulting from this input, we make use of the stuff and the energy. We get all those benefits that we're all very familiar with, but the energy and materials doesn't go away. The laws of conservation say they stay quantitatively the same, but they degrade, which means we have to we get rid of them into the environment. We overload the systems there, sadly, local to global. That's what overshoot is about. And we have to keep going back for more materials and energy. And we're doing this more and more year after year. Now, unless you factor that perspective into your understanding of the economy, then you are missing a very, very important part of the story in the 21st century, where the sizes of these flows, as I was saying, are so enormous and growing. So, what are our chances of changing that? Well, I don't think, funnily enough, the place to start is necessarily in the way economics is taught. Economists, like some of the investors that I think that, or the investment advisors, financial advisors you write about, typically take an optimistic view. Well, we'll just get more resources, or the prices will go up when there's scarcity, and we'll invent new technologies. It's very easy to sort of persuade yourself that technological change can solve any problem that we encounter, and so we can just carry on. And that's a very difficult situation. What I'm seeing, though, is especially among younger people, a much greater openness and awareness of this larger situation than just the economy being something that's on its own. And that gives me some cause for personal optimism that change may be happening in the way people think about our situation. Because without that, I think the future looks very bleak indeed.
It's as though the people that are fat and happy and have enjoyed things for a for their lifetime up to date, and I'll define that as, let's say, anybody who's over 35 or 40, doesn't want to contemplate having to change because they've grown fat and happy and enjoying life, and they don't they're happy to talk about change as long as they themselves don't have to make any kind of a personal sacrifice that has an impact on their quality of life. But of course, that's easier said than done. And it's the generation that is worried about housing, and the generation that's worried about what kind of a climate they're going to live in, and whether they can even bring children and grandchildren into the planet down the road. They're the ones that are staring the situation squarely in the eye, and not surprisingly, they're the ones that get it. When it comes to these people being voters and the economy being understood, we hear a lot from politicians about the need to grow the economy. The metric they use all the time is the GDP, and they'll look at what's sustainable. And when they say sustainable, they mean from a financial sense. And so they'll look at the debt to GDP ratio. But the way people keep score is on the presumption that economic growth is to be taken as a given, and in fact is a public policy imperative. And one of the things I came across over and over and over again from the Escape from Overshoot in reading it is that we actually have to disabuse ourselves of the notion of economic growth as being our objective. And in fact, it is our greatest challenge. We have to find a way to turn the corner to be happy and to flourish without necessarily growing. Could you comment on that, please?
Yes, well, I first of all, I'd like to make a distinction between economic growth as it's normally understood and the growth in materials and energy use that I was just talking about before, because although they can be connected, and historically often have been, they're very different things. The economic growth you talk about, and you're quite right in your remarks, by the way, I agree with what you said, is measured by an increase in gross domestic product. Now, gross domestic product, I suggest, is not well understood by most people, and I would include most politicians. They don't know how it's measured, they don't know what it includes and what it excludes. So let me just say the simplest way to understand it is it includes all final expenditures in the economy. So all the purchases we make in the stores are final expenditures. What it doesn't include are the intermediate expenditures, such as the flour that goes into the bread, isn't included in GDP. Only the bread is included in GDP when it's bought and sold. But it doesn't distinguish between things that we really want to have, like food, and things that we're only buying because we've really got no alternative. So when we spend more money on gasoline because commuting times are getting longer, uh, nobody really wants that, but it all goes into GDP. If we're feeling more unsafe and we hire security companies to protect us, that's part of GDP, and so on. But it excludes other things which we do value, like work in the home is valuable, but it's not included in GDP. And you mentioned externalities, which, for the benefit of the listeners, refers to aspects of the economy outside of the transactions that we keep track of. So the pollution that companies cause when they produce their products and the health effects of that, it's not included in GDP. So why anyone would want this number, which is such a jumble of things, to increase and to drive policy to the extent that it does, is really very peculiar. Um, so I'm calling for, and the book is all about, how we might reduce the physical requirements of our economy. And whatever then happens to GDP will happen to it. I suspect it won't grow as fast and it may shrink, but we can still improve well-being, particularly in the high-income countries such as Canada, the US, and most of Europe, um, without having an increase in GDP. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I need to get those
Well,
points out there.
well, it's funny because one thing that we don't even think of, and it's not exactly an externality, it's a common good, things like fresh air. We want to be able to get to the office and back quickly, but if it means spending more time in traffic, and people will complain about the price of fuel and carbon taxes and whatnot. But if you don't do these things, the air will become smoggier, and your quality of life will be worse, and your children will have asthma, and then that's going to increase healthcare costs, and it's going to reduce your quality of life because you can't kick around a soccer ball on a Sunday afternoon with your children because the air is too bad. And there are a lot of things like that that are quite literally priceless, that there's no price on that society has put on them, but that could very well be taken away down the road. And I don't think I think my concern is that we as a society have become coddled and have come to take these things that are so wonderful for granted. And then when someone starts to put a price on pollution, for instance, we get upset about, well, how dare you do this? But it's the only way to get people to change behavior is to make things that were otherwise free to put a price on them.
Well, that is certainly one way, and it's the way that economists uh, have been proposing for a long, long time. And the price on carbon emissions is just one example of that. That
Right.
method was used with some success to deal with acid rain back in the 80s, particularly in the US. So there are situations where putting a price on the emissions to discourage them can be effective. But there's another whole approach to this. The idea of pricing pollutants uh, is based on the idea that people won't do the right thing unless you kind of force them to, either by regulation or by making them pay a price, a financial penalty for acting in the right way. But the other approach is to change people's values, to change, or if not change their values, because I think actually people's values aren't in such bad shape. It's a misalignment of behavior and values. And I think you were mentioning this before. I don't think it's that people don't realize the importance of fresh air and clean water, but they don't realize the connection between their behavior and the behavior of everybody else, and why we don't have enough access to fresh air and clean water. So it's finding a way to internalize the value of nature. And this is why I'm such a great supporter of outdoor education as being part of the educational program. How can children growing up in an overbuilt city value nature if they're not exposed to it on an ongoing basis? Another point, though, that some of your remarks prompt me to say is that um, it's okay to say that people in rich countries are coddled. But of course, there's a lot of people living in poor circumstances around the world who are anything but coddled. 2 points to make here. One is that the more we can back off in the rich countries from using the materials and energy that nature can provide, and the more we, if you like, create some ecological space for other people on the planet who are more disadvantaged, the better chance we have of seeing them raise their standard of living. But it doesn't come free. And what I mean by that is we've got to pay some of the price for that, for giving up some of the things we've taken for granted. And well, I had another point, but as typically happens as you get older, it floats away from you as you speak. So
Okay,
maybe it'll
well,
come
let's
back to
move
me.
on. One of the other things that I loved about Escape from Overshoot is that it not only deals with economists over the past, let's say, 200 or 250 years going back to Adam Smith, but it's chock a block full of economists that are not household names that have been doing groundbreaking research over the past 30 or 40 years in what might broadly be called environmental economics. So I can't remember all of them. I can't touch on all of them, but one that I think is of some importance that I'm wondering if you could comment on is Kate Rayworth and her idea of a donut economy. Could you perhaps take a moment to explain what that is? Because I found that to be a paradigm that resonated with me and hopefully it will with listeners as well.
Right. Well, um, in 2009, a very important scientific paper was published on the topic of planetary boundaries. A group of about 24, 25 scientists got together and said, look, there are these globally significant environmental problems, some of which I've already mentioned: climate change, biodiversity loss, excess use of nutrients that are damaging the soils and so on. And they put these labels around a picture of the Earth. And then they said, within the planet, there is a safe, what they called operating capacity for humans. In other words, if we moderate what we do, then we can live within the planet and not exceed what they called the planetary boundaries that apply to each of these problems. And they tried to establish these planetary boundaries in numbers. They came up with a planetary boundary for the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere might be X, for example. They give it a number. They didn't. These are judgment calls. They're judgment. Someone not unlike what you obviously do within the financial world, and that is how much risk are you willing to bear? If you're risk averse, then that boundary is going to be a tighter boundary. If you're prepared to take a big risk of irreversible change, you set the boundary higher. Well, they established these boundaries. Now, you asked about Kate Rayworth. She saw that diagram and she said, let's make a change. Let's hollow out the middle of it. And that's why it's called a donut, because it looks like at least a North American donut, no jam filling. It's got a hole in the middle. And in that hole, she put in the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN promoted and all countries in the world essentially have signed off on. And she said the real task we're facing is how do we meet those social development goals at the same time as stay within the planetary boundaries? And this visual of the donut has really been very successful in conveying these ideas that we've got limits on from living on the planet, and we've got social and economic and political objectives that we want to meet. Can we meet them and stay within the boundaries? And the donut is now being used as a sort of a framework for discussing policy at all levels, global down to local. And all power to her for being able to present this image and persuade lots of people that it's a nice framework within which to tackle some really difficult problems.
One of the things that Rayworth has, and I don't know if you can remember this off the top of your head, but she had a section that you put in the book about the 7 ways that you can think like a 21st century economist. Could you? And I'm not going to ask you to rhyme them off, but if you can maybe off the top of your head think of one or two or three of them, perhaps you could give people an idea of what a true contemporary economist thinks about as compared to the economists of yesteryear.
Well, I'll give you a couple. Thank you for not asking
Okay.
me to recite all
Okay.
seven.
Good.
One is a shift away from growing GDP, which we've already mentioned, to well-being. Well-being is the objective of public policy. In other words, when government is thinking of what it should do, the answer should be framed in terms of how it will contribute not just to human well-being, at least this is the way I interpret it, but also what you might call ecological well-being, because without the one, you won't have the other. Um, and this has been taken up to some extent by some governments, either formally or informally. But it also can apply at all levels, and it can apply to companies as well, though that may be more difficult for them. But anyway, the idea that uh, uh, thinking about economics in the 21st century, it should be directed at well-being. And sometimes people say happiness, sometimes flourishing. There's a lot of different language around this,
Yeah.
means much the same thing. A second key element, and this is one very close to my heart, is to think in terms of systems. Uh, of course, whenever we think about the world, we have to simplify. We're just not capable of encompassing all the
Right.
complexity of everything that's going on within our brain. So the nature of the simplification really matters. Well, there's this approach called system dynamics. By the way, it was what was used in the Limits to Growth book that you described earlier in our discussion. Um, it's actually quite simple to use. Basically, it says that a lot can be understood about the world if we think of stocks of things. That could be stocks of raw materials, stocks of houses, stocks of people as well. And those stocks vary in size according to what's coming into them and what's going out of them. It's like
So,
a bathtub, if you like. The
yeah.
amount of water in the bathtub is going to be determined by how much is coming in, how much is going out. It gets interesting when you realize that these inflows and outflows can be interconnected. So, for example, the birth rate, which adds to the population, can be influenced by the death rate, or it can be influenced by the size of the population. Well, in system dynamics, we use this kind of set of concepts to describe and analyze the behavior of the system. Now, this approach isn't that widely used in economics. Some of my own work, excuse me, has tried to remedy that. So I built with my colleague Tim Jackson in Britain, a simulation model of the Canadian economy, which is built along those lines. And what it allows you to do is to say, well, okay, suppose the economy wasn't growing so fast. Wouldn't that create large amounts of unemployment? That's a very legitimate concern. Well, one answer to that is to shorten the average work week. If we work less, then the amount of work that is implicit in the economy that's not growing or consistent with that would be shared among more people. So income would be shared more, and you wouldn't have high unemployment. Well, you can investigate whether that relationship is robust or fragile or even possible at all within this framework of system dynamics. So those are two things that are within the donut framework, but they exist outside the donut framework as well. People have been investigating these things for some time in different ways, but I think they really can help us understand our predicament much better than is currently the case.
My last real question pertains to a phrase that I hear all the time in finance that I don't think I read in the book, but I kept on thinking about it, and that is the phrase trees don't grow to the sky. It's based on a German proverb. And in my line of work, what that means is, no matter how much a stock has gone up in price, or no matter how much a market has gone up in price, it cannot continue to climb indefinitely. There will be times when things will pull back. As it pertains to the ecosystem of planet Earth, it's the same sort of notion, I would think, in terms of we can't deplete resources indefinitely, would be another way of saying that, perhaps. Do you think so? In my line of work, there is at least some degree of recognition of limits, although it might be a bit self-serving in the way it's being described, but at least there's some grudging recognition of limits with regard to the growth of a stock price or the growth of an economy. With regard to planet Earth, um, I, I would portray it as being a form of cognitive dissonance on behalf of Western society, that we just don't want to countenance the idea of there being limits to what we can do, and having to make lifestyle changes in order to accommodate those limits. Do you have any kind of a commentary with regard to societal attitudes, and what needs to be done in order to turn the corner, to move away from growth and toward quality of life and flourishing and wellness?
Well, that's a big question. First of all, let me say that I think the worldview that we've developed as humans, or the worldviews we've developed as humans, came about through historical experience that began to change dramatically with the Industrial Revolution. People were very aware of limits up to that point because they were so obvious. You're living in rural areas, agricultural situations. Uh, Everything was limited by the amount of food, not everything, but many things by the amount of food that was available. And the human population took whatever it was, 100, 200,000 years from Homo sapiens to a billion of us on the planet at the year 1800 or thereabouts. Now we're at 8 billion plus in only 200 years. The whole history of mankind got us to 1 billion, and in 200 years, we're now 8 billion. And many of us living way beyond just subsistence level. But our worldview and captured to some extent in religion, in some of the great writings of the world, what parents taught their children, the expectation that your life would be much the same as your parents. That changed for a couple of hundred years in many parts of the world. Um, that hasn't kept up. That's still there. But now we've got to come to terms with our new circumstances. And there's some good news here. If you dig hard enough, there is some good news. You mentioned flourishing. You mentioned we've talked about well-being. Well, when you look at what human activities generate the greatest sense of well-being, many of these activities do not require a lot of resources. So reading a book, even reading online, I would say, although there's hidden electrical requirements that people are often completely unaware of. But nonetheless, compared with driving a new car, for example, way less resource intensive. And I saw a study not long ago of about 100 flourishing activities and they were all very small in terms of their requirements for resources were very low. What this opens up then is the opportunity for us to have better well-being, higher levels of well-being, and a lower resource requirement. And some of this can be understood in terms of how do we use our time. If you sit around with friends, go to the bar, have a drink, whatever you want to do. These don't have to be very resource intensive. If you insist on getting on a plane and flying halfway around the world to see a waterfall or whatever, that's a different story. And so we've got to be prepared, I think, to make adjustments in the way we live. And I think one of the themes of your questions to me has been that.
Yeah.
But doing that, people should understand, can in fact make us feel better and
Right.
not worse.
Great. That's a nice, optimistic way of ending the main questions. I always like to end my interviews with two things that come up all the time. The first is something I call "that's bullshit." What would you point to in the financial services industry that you think is a real problem?
Well, I'm by no means an expert in the financial services industry, but here's the perspective I would bring. There are many kinds of expenditures that need to be made for us to escape from overshoot or for us to deal with the environmental problems that are abound. And many of these expenditures do not yield a profit. And so, if to the extent that the financial services industry is trying to maximize the financial returns of the clients, there's a mismatch resulting between the way money is invested in our economy and some of the requirements that we need. I'll give you an example. If you want to, if a company said we're going to build seawalls at our own expense, and it'll be very good, it'll protect the shorelines from the rising sea levels, will you invest? Well, the first thing an investor is going to ask, well, where will my return be? Well, you'll be saving lives, you'll be saving habitat, there'll be better agricultural land, but none of that flows to the investor. And so it's very difficult, I would say impossible, to see how the normal way in which the financial services operate in channeling funds to so many of the things that we need, A, to protect ourselves from the deteriorating circumstances, and B, to reduce the pressures that we're putting on the planet because of the way our economy runs and so on.
Okay,
That's
so
the
that okay,
problem.
let's okay, so let's see if we can then turn the corner to moving to shift habits. If it's up to Peter Victor, and we have these problems where there are common goods that are not being recognized by the financial services industry, and not no resources are being devoted toward them because there's no obvious personal profit. How would you solve that problem? What would you recommend as being a way to shift things to make things better?
Well, I happen to get advice on my rather modest investment portfolio from a financial advisor who specializes in socially responsible investment. And so this is a simple matter. I tell her what my priorities are that go beyond profit or
Right.
not, and she seeks out investments that she thinks meets my priorities. And this is how she works with all her clients. But it seems to be a niche part of the financial services sector instead of being generally the way people invest their funds, and the people in the financial services sector provide the right kind of advice.
Well, it's a growing niche, so that's worthwhile as well. Peter, I want to thank you. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. I've enjoyed reading your work, and it's been a pleasure getting to know you as well. All the best to you in the future.
Oh, thank you very much, John. It's my pleasure too. Bye bye now.
John DeGooey is a portfolio manager in Toronto and the author of the book Bullshift: How Optimism Bias Threatens Your Finances. Bullshift is available online and in bookstores everywhere. The opinions expressed in this podcast should not be construed as investment advice. Bullshift, the podcast, is produced by TalkShoe, a division of IOTM.